The declassified version of Biden's intelligence community assessment into the origins of the COVID virus has been released. And it tells us more about our intelligence agencies and the Biden administration than it does about the origins of the virus. The report seems determined to avoid the use of readily available information and instead chooses to reinforce what is unknown. The report also takes obvious pains not to upset the Chinese Communist Party. We examine each segment of the report and provide the answers that the intelligence community refuses to address. Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News with Jeff Carlson and Hans Manke.
The intelligence community assesses that the virus emerged and infected humans no later than November 2019. We assess this statement to be mostly accurate. According to the medical journal The Lancet, the first known case of COVID-19 occurred on December 1st, 2019. The patient had no known ties to the Huanan seafood market. A March 2021 WHO report later falsely stated that the first known case happened on December 8th, 2019. And in a new documentary about the pandemic, famed epidemiologist Ian Lipkin, who initially promoted the natural origins narrative but has since shifted his position, says that he first heard about the outbreak on December 15th, which is more than 2 weeks before the CCP even acknowledged that they had a problem. The intelligence community report states that we judge the virus was not developed as a biological weapon. We see this statement as plausible but difficult to assess. The Wuhan lab had a close genetic match to the virus in their possession for 7 years, and the scientists there, with knowledge of the virus, wrote a number of articles on the virus. At the same time, it's likely the China CDC had obtained a sample of this virus. Much less is known of their work than of the Institute of Virology. It seems reasonable to assume that if the virus had been developed as a bioweapon, its release was entirely accidental, as the initial outbreak took place on China's soil and no vaccine had been developed in advance.
Most agencies assess that the virus was not genetically engineered. 2 agencies dissent, citing insufficient evidence to make any assessment. We assess this statement as misleading. The issue revolves around the meaning of genetically engineered. Fauci himself repeatedly split hairs on the definition of what exactly genetically engineered means. We know that the Wuhan lab was genetically modifying bat viruses. This is documented in a litany of research papers put out by the lab since at least 2007. But the lab was also conducting serial passage experiments. Serial passage refers to the process of speeding up the evolution of a virus by growing it in a lab in repeated iterations. Using this process, the virus evolves through mutations, only much more quickly than in nature. This was the actual justification cited by Fauci for conducting experiments like this in the first place, to get a glimpse into the future of what might happen if a virus was left to evolve naturally over decades. In the end, it does not really matter whether mutations are inserted in a lab or mutations are accelerated in a lab. It's still genetic engineering. The intelligence community assesses China's officials did not have foreknowledge of the virus before the initial outbreak of COVID-19 emerged. We assess this statement as mixed and poorly worded. What does foreknowledge of the virus mean? If it means foreknowledge of what was going to happen, then that is simply another way of saying that the outbreak resulted from a bioweapon. If foreknowledge of the virus means that officials overseeing the Wuhan lab knew that it had dangerous viruses in its lab, they clearly had foreknowledge. We know the lab had the RATG13 virus, linked to the deaths of 3 minors in 2012. And we know they had it in their possession for at least 7 years. We also know that the head of the Chinese CDC, Gao Fu, was aware of this virus being brought to Wuhan. And we know that Tian Zhonghua of the Wuhan CDC brought 10,000 further bat viruses into Wuhan CDC lab.
The intelligence community remains divided on the most likely origin of COVID-19. All agencies assess that both natural exposure to an infected animal and a laboratory-associated incident are possible. We assess this statement to be intentionally nonspecific. The assessment of this statement depends, in part, on the meaning of natural exposure to an infected animal. Fauci himself acknowledged in May of 2020 that the virus could have been brought to the lab and infected someone there, arguing that that would count as natural exposure. We know that Wuhan CDC official Tian Zhonghua, by his own admission, spent years collecting live bats in the wild and bringing them back to Wuhan. And he often did so without taking any safety precautions. We also know that Peter Ben Emmerich, the WHO's lead investigator, privately stated that he believed China's CDC lab was a likely source for the virus leak. Lastly, the first known patient had no known exposure to the Huanan seafood market, so often blamed by those promoting natural origins as the source of the outbreak. 4 intelligence agencies and the National Intelligence Council assess with low confidence that the initial infection was most likely caused by natural exposure to an animal infected with the virus or a closely related virus. A closely related virus was defined by the intelligence community to be 99% similar. Notably, these analysts give weight to China's officials' lack of foreknowledge, the numerous vectors for natural exposure, and other uncited factors. We assess this statement to be both inaccurate and lacking in logic, and we question why the IC would demand a 99% match when we know the Wuhan lab maintained a virus with a 96% genetic match to COVID. And of course, if this was a lab accident, no one would have had foreknowledge. While there are numerous vectors for natural exposure, that exposure has so far not been found. During the initial SARS outbreak in 2003, when technology and sequencing were far more rudimentary than they are now, it took just a few months to trace the virus of that outbreak to civet cats. And unlike other natural outbreaks, the COVID-19 virus emerged already perfectly adapted to binding with human cells. In fact, studies have shown that COVID-19 binds stronger to humans than any other animal, including alleged progenitors such as pangolins. Also apparently overlooked by these 4 IC agencies is that SARS and MERS killed only a few hundred people. COVID has so far killed 5 million, strongly suggesting that COVID is not, in fact, like these other viruses.